The SOS that changed everything. The vastness of space was silent, endless. Stars shimmered in the darkness like distant candles, and the great warships of the Deathworlders drifted through the void. They were built for battle, forged in war, and their crews were ready for anything. Or so they thought. On board the Dagger's Edge, a Deathworlder patrol ship, Captain Ralvik leaned over the console, his sharp eyes scanning the endless data streams. It had been a quiet patrol so far. Too quiet. Then suddenly, the silence shattered. A signal appeared, an old distress call, weak but repeating. The crew froze. Signals like this didn't just appear. They were either traps or warnings. Ralvik frowned. Source. The communication officer, a young soldier named Dren, checked the readings. His face paled. It's coming from Sector 12. The Vorlis system. The bridge fell silent. Vorlis. A system long forgotten. A system destroyed centuries ago. The record said it was wiped out by an unknown force. No survivors. No remains. Just an empty graveyard floating in the void. And yet, the signal was coming from there. Ralvik's fingers tightened around the edge of his console. He played the message aloud. A broken, static-filled voice whispered through the ship's speakers. "Help us. They are coming. We are the last." The word sent chills through the crew. It didn't sound like a trick. It sounded real. Desperate. Terrified. A second voice cut in. Weaker, barely a whisper. "They will return, and we are not ready." Then silence. The signal repeated, over and over. Ralvik turned to his crew. "Get me a visual on Vorlis. Now." The screen flickered. A deep, dark world appeared, its surface covered in ruins. Half-buried cities stretched across the land, broken towers reaching toward the sky like the fingers of the dead. But that wasn't the worst part. In the shadows of the wreckage, something moved. Not one thing. Not two. Hundreds. Maybe thousands. Dren swallowed hard. "Sir, there are life signs down there." Ralvik stared at the screen. Survivors. After all these years. How? His second-in-command, Officer Lyra, stepped forward. "Sir, this has to be a trap. That colony was wiped out. There shouldn't be anything left." Ralvik hesitated. Logic told him to ignore it. His instincts screamed otherwise. If there were survivors, they couldn't be left to die. "We're going in," he said firmly. "Prepare a scout team. I want boots on the ground in 1 hour." Lyra hesitated but nodded. "Aye, sir." The Dagger's Edge turned toward Vorlis, its engines burning bright in the darkness. The crew moved quickly, readying weapons, armor, and supplies. But deep inside the ruined colony, something else was watching. The old distress signal continued to play, whispering through the dead city. "They are coming." And in the blackness of space, beyond the reach of scanners, something else began to move. Something ancient. Something waiting. Ralvik didn't know it yet, but by answering this call, he had just started a war. The decision to go to war. The Dagger's Edge cut through the void, its engines burning a trail toward the dead world of Vorlis. Every soldier on board felt the weight of the mission. No one spoke. No one needed to. The distress signal repeated in the background. "Help us. They are coming. We are the last." Captain Ralvik sat in the command chair, his fingers drumming against the armrest. The message haunted him. If there were survivors after all these years, it meant two things. Something had kept them alive, and something had kept them trapped. "Status?" Ralvik asked. Lyra checked her screen. "Scanners show faint life signs, but we can't pinpoint them. Too much interference." Ralvik's jaw tightened. Something was jamming their systems. "Launch the probe," he ordered. A small drone shot forward, its cameras sending live footage to the bridge. The ruined colony stretched beneath them. Crumbling towers, broken streets, shattered buildings. It was a tomb. But then the screen flickered. Shadows shifted between the ruins. The probe zoomed in. Figures. Moving. Watching. Ralvik leaned in. Enhance. The image sharpened, revealing emaciated humanoids with hollow eyes and scarred skin. They were hiding in the ruins, dressed in tattered armor, holding weapons too advanced for a colony that had fallen centuries ago. Drin gulped. Sir, those aren't just survivors. Those are fighters. Lyra cursed. How the hell did they last this long? Before Ralvik could answer, the probe screamed, a sharp, static-filled noise. Then the screen went black. Probe destroyed. Drin confirmed, his voice shaking. Ralvik stood. Enough waiting. We deploy now. The descent. The shuttle cut through Vorla's toxic atmosphere, heat shielding glowing as it entered the storm-covered sky. Lightning crackled, casting eerie light over the dead world. Inside the shuttle, the Deathworlder soldiers readied their weapons. Their armor was thick, designed for brutal combat. They weren't explorers. They were warriors. The moment the shuttle landed, the ramp dropped, and the team spread out. Eyes up, Lyra muttered, scanning the area. This place is. A gunshot rang out. A soldier dropped, blood spraying the dirt. Ambush. The ruins erupted with fire. The survivors. They weren't scared, weak people. They were hardened warriors, and they weren't welcoming visitors. Ralvik dived behind cover, raising his rifle. Hold fire. We're here to help. A voice snarled through the comms. Help. There is no help. There is only survival. Then, from the darkness, they appeared. Not just survivors. Ghosts of war. Their leader stepped forward, his face covered in scars. He held an ancient rifle, but his stance was strong, his eyes sharp. Ralvik met his gaze. Who are you? The man exhaled. We were the last. Now, we are the first. Ralvik didn't understand, until the sky above them turned red. Alarms blared from the shuttle. Drin's panicked voice came through the radio. Sir, we have inbound ships. Multiple. Wait, oh gods. The transmission cut off. Above them, the stars disappeared as massive warships emerged from the void. The Shadow Fleet had arrived. And now, the Deathworlders had no choice. They were at war. The Shadow Fleet's arrival. The sky over Vorlis burned red as colossal warships emerged from the void. Their jagged black hulls absorbed light, giving them the appearance of shadows given form. No markings, no insignia, just silent monsters drifting into battle formation. On the ground, Captain Ralvik's soldiers braced themselves. Multiple contacts inbound. Dren's voice crackled through the comms. They just appeared out of nowhere. Ralvik clenched his jaw. He had seen many battles, but nothing like this. Lyra scanned the sky. Sir, if those ships open fire, we're dead. The survivors, the warriors who had ambushed them, did not run. Instead, they stood firm, gripping their weapons tighter. Their leader, the scared man, watched the sky with cold, knowing eyes. This was always going to happen, he muttered. Ralvik turned to him. Who are you? The man didn't answer right away. He looked at the Deathworlders, not with fear, but with expectation. Then he spoke. I am Kieran, last survivor of the Vorlis War. His voice was steel. And if you're smart, you'll stop looking at us and start looking at them. Ralvik followed his gaze. One of the Shadow Fleet's ships had broken formation, descending toward the surface like a silent executioner. It was enormous, a predator drifting toward its prey. Then, in an instant, black pods rained from the warship's underbelly. Incoming Durop pods, Lyra shouted. The first impact was like a meteor strike. Dust and fire exploded into the air. The second hit even harder. Then the pods opened, and they stepped out. The unseen enemy. They weren't machines. They weren't aliens. They were something worse. Tall, armored figures glided across the battlefield, their bodies covered in shifting black plates that seemed to drink in the light. Their faces were smooth, empty, with only two glowing slits for eyes. They moved without sound. No battle cries, no growls, just silence. And then, one of them vanished. Ralvik blinked. Where did it? A scream. One of his soldiers dropped, a blade of pure darkness buried in his chest. The enemy had moved too fast to see. Then another vanished, then another. Panic erupted. Soldiers opened fire, but the bullets passed straight through some of them, as if they weren't even real. Others took direct hits and kept coming, their bodies repairing the damage in seconds. "This isn't a battle," Kieran said coldly. "It's a hunt." Ralvik gritted his teeth. "No, not today." He grabbed his comm. "Dagger's edge, get us the hell out of here." Static. Lyra checked her device. "They're jamming us." Ralvik cursed. "We hold the line. Fall back to the shuttle." Kieran grabbed his arm. "No." Ralvik snapped his head toward him. "Excuse me. You try to run, you die. You stand and fight. You have a chance." Ralvik wasn't used to being given orders, especially by a ghost from a dead war. But something in Kieran's voice, it wasn't fear, it was experience. Kieran lifted his rifle. "You want to survive this." The Deathworlders and the survivors locked eyes. A silent understanding passed between them. They weren't enemies anymore. Ralvik nodded. "All right." He turned to his soldiers. "We hold the line. No more running. Let's show them what Deathworlders can do." The warriors braced themselves. Weapons hummed to life. Armor locked into combat mode. The Shadow Fleet's warriors paused for a moment, as if sensing the shift in the air. Then they attacked. And the war for Vorlis began. Deathworlders don't run. The battlefield was chaos. The Shadow Fleet's warriors moved like ghosts, flickering in and out of sight, striking without warning and vanishing before bullets could find them. Their weapons weren't normal. They were shards of pure void, cutting through armor, flesh, and bone like smoke in the wind. But the Deathworlders did not run. Ralvik slammed his back against a fallen transport, reloading his rifle in a heartbeat. He could hear the screams, the sound of energy blades tearing through metal and flesh. But he ignored them. Lyra crouched beside him, breathing hard. "They're too fast. We're losing ground." Ralvik smirked. "Good." Lyra blinked. "Good." Ralvik yanked a grenade from his belt, activated the fuse, and tossed it into the open. A shadowy figure materialized just in time to catch the explosion point blank. "We're drawing them in." Ralvik grinned. "Now we kill them." The trap is set. Kieran, the scared survivor, moved like a predator among prey. He had no fear. He had seen these creatures before. He knew their weaknesses. One of the shadowed figures lunged at him, but Kieran didn't flinch. Instead, he dropped low, sidestepping the attack with perfect precision. As the enemy flickered out of sight, Kieran spun, grabbing something from his belt. A small silver sphere. He slammed it into the ground. For the first time, the battlefield shook. A shockwave of blue light erupted outward, rippling across the ground. The shadowed figures froze, their bodies flickering wildly, as if they were glitches in reality. Their speed, gone. Their ability to phase, broken. Kieran grinned. "Phase inhibitors. Bet you bastards didn't expect that." Ralvik's eyes widened. "You had those the whole time." Kieran smirked. "Had to make sure you were worth saving first." Ralvik laughed, adrenaline pumping through his veins. "Then let's make it count." The Deathworlders strike back. The enemy was fast. But now, they weren't faster than humans. Ralvik and his squad charged, their weapons roaring to life. The first shot took a shadow's head clean off, the body collapsing like shattered glass. Lyra spun midair, planting a boot in an enemy's chest before blasting its skull apart at point-blank range. The Deathworlders fought like monsters. They didn't hold their ground. They took it back. Kieran moved like a storm, cutting through enemy ranks with surgical brutality. Every shot landed. Every move was calculated. He wasn't just fighting to survive. He was fighting to win. The Shadow Warriors, so used to being invincible, were losing ground fast. Their advantage had been stripped away. Now, they were just targets, and Deathworlders never missed. The warship reacts. High above, the massive Shadow Fleet warship finally realized something was wrong. Its ground forces faltering. Its warriors dying. For the first time, it responded. A low hum filled the air. The skies darkened, and the battlefield was bathed in a cold violet light. Lyra's heart stopped. What is that? Kiran's face turned pale. They're changing tactics. From the warship's underbelly, a new form of nightmare was unleashed. Not warriors, not ships. Something worse. A towering figure descended, wrapped in a cloak of black mist, its eyes burning deep violet. Unlike the others, it did not flicker or phase. It did not move with speed. It simply stood, radiating pure death. Kiran's voice was grim. It's not a soldier. Ralvik gritted his teeth. Then what is it? Kiran swallowed hard. It's a commander. The battlefield fell silent. The real fight was about to begin. The nightmare that walked. The battlefield was eerily silent. For the first time since the fight began, the Shadow Warriors were no longer attacking. The survivors had retreated, fading into the mist like whispers in the wind. And at the center of it all, the nightmare stood, towering, watching, waiting. It was no ordinary soldier, no assassin, no mindless brute. It was something far worse. Ralvik gripped his weapon tightly, but his hands felt weak. He had faced death before. He had seen comrades torn apart, had fought through blood and fire. But this was something else. Even standing still, the nightmare radiated pure terror. The air itself felt heavy, pressing down on his chest like an unseen force. Lyra took a step forward and immediately stumbled, her breath caught in her throat. "Dilu what? What is this?" Kiran's face was pale, his usual smirk completely gone. "That," he said, his voice cold, "is not a warrior. It's a revenant. The revenant speaks." Then it moved. Not with speed, not with aggression. It simply raised its hand. The moment it did, Ralvik felt a pressure inside his skull, as if something was trying to reach into his mind. He clenched his teeth, fighting against it. But Lyra let out a gasp, dropping to her knees, her eyes wide with fear. A voice, not spoken, but felt, echoed inside their heads. "You are nothing." Lyra let out a choked cry, clutching her head. Ralvik roared in defiance, forcing himself to stand. "Get out of my head, you bastard." The revenant turned its gaze toward him. It wasn't just looking at him. It was peeling him open. Ralvik's memories flashed before his eyes. His childhood, his first battle, the people he had lost. It saw everything. Weak, pathetic. Ralvik staggered, but he didn't fall. The revenant tilted its head slightly, as if amused. "You will break." Then it took a step forward. The ground beneath it withered, turning black and cracked, as if the very life had been drained away. Lyra was trembling. Even Kiran, the hardened veteran, was gripping his rifle so tightly his knuckles had gone white. And that was when Ralvik knew. This wasn't a soldier. This wasn't even a commander. This was a weapon. A desperate plan. Ralvik's mind was racing. Think. Think. He knew one thing. It couldn't fight this thing head-on. Kiran seemed to realize it too. He took a slow step back, voice low. "We need to run." Lyra's head snapped up. "Run? You're kidding." "Do I look like I'm kidding?" Kiran hissed. "We can't fight this thing. I don't even know if we can kill it." Ralvik's instincts screamed at him to agree. Every cell in his body was telling him to turn, to flee, to survive. But then he saw something. The Revenant wasn't attacking yet. It was testing them, watching, learning, and that meant it wasn't invincible. Ralvik took a deep breath. We're not running. Kieran stared at him. You have a death wish. Ralvik's mind was racing. He pointed at the phase inhibitors they had used before. Those things worked on the Shadow Fleet's warriors, right? Kieran nodded. Yeah, but... Ralvik grinned. Then we just need a bigger one. Lyra's eyes widened. You're not suggesting. The dropship, Ralvik interrupted. It has a pulse detonation field. If we rig it to overload. Kieran laughed, shaking his head. That would hit everything within 100 meters. Ralvik met his gaze. Exactly. The gamble. They moved fast. The Revenant did not chase them. It simply walked, as if it knew they couldn't escape. Every step it took, the world around it darkened, as if light itself was being swallowed. Ralvik, Kieran, and Lyra sprinted toward the wreckage of their dropship. Sparks flickered from the shattered hull, but the power core was still intact. Kieran was already working, fingers flying across the exposed circuitry. This is insane, he muttered. Completely insane. Lyra kept watch, eyes darting toward the approaching figure. It's getting closer. Ralvik swallowed hard. 30 seconds. The Revenant tilted its head, sensing their plan. Then it spoke again. Foolish. The word hit them like a physical force. Ralvik nearly fell to his knees. The Revenant raised its hand, and the air itself began to twist. Detonation. Now, Kieran roared. The pulse detonation field activated. A shockwave of blue energy exploded outward, engulfing everything within its radius. The Revenant vanished in the blast. For a moment, there was nothing. Then, a low, echoing laugh filled the air. Ralvik's blood ran cold. The smoke cleared. The Revenant was still standing, untouched, and it was smiling. Ralvik felt fear for the first time in his life. Run, Kieran whispered. No one argued, because for the first time in history, the Deathworlders were outmatched. The monster that wouldn't die. Ralvik had fought monsters before, but nothing like this. His legs burned as he sprinted through the wreckage of the battlefield, Lyra and Kieran right beside him. Behind them, the Revenant walked, not rushing, not chasing. It didn't need to. It was inevitable. Where the hell are we running to? Kieran shouted, barely dodging a twisted piece of metal. Ralvik had no answer. There was nowhere to go. The dropship was destroyed. Their weapons had done nothing. And the Revenant was still smiling. Nowhere to run. Lyra gasped, pointing ahead. The canyon. If we reach the canyon, we can. Her words cut off as the world twisted around them. Ralvik's vision blurred. The sky rippled like a disturbed pond. Suddenly, they weren't running toward the canyon anymore. They were back where they started, right in front of the Revenant. Ralvik's breath hitched. No, that's impossible. Lyra turned, her face drained of color. It's bending reality. The Revenant tilted its head. You still do not understand. Its voice was like a whisper in their bones. Kieran roared in frustration, raising his weapon and firing. A direct hit. Center mass. The bullet never reached it. It simply vanished, dissolving into mist before it could even touch the Revenant's body. Kieran's hands trembled. What the hell is this thing? Ralvik gritted his teeth, something that's not supposed to exist. The warning. Lyra's voice was barely a whisper. This isn't a soldier. Ralvik turned to her. What? She swallowed hard. I've studied the Shadow Fleet's history. They never deploy their Revenants. Kieran frowned. What are you saying? I'm saying. She hesitated, then took a shaky breath. The Revenant isn't a weapon. She looked up, terror in her eyes. It's a message. Ralvik's stomach dropped. A message, Kieran repeated. Lyra nodded. Every time a civilization pushes too far, tries to challenge the Shadow Fleet directly. They send one of these. She gestured to the Revenant, not to destroy them, to warn them. What lies beyond? Ralvik turned back to the Revenant. It wasn't attacking them. Not really. It was testing them, measuring their strength, seeing if they were worth the trouble. And suddenly, Ralvik understood. This war isn't about us. Lyra and Karen stared at him. Ralvik took a step forward. The Revenant's gaze snapped to him. Ralvik ignored the terror in his chest. You could have killed us a dozen times already. You could have wiped us from existence without trying. The Revenant said nothing. Ralvik clenched his fists. But you didn't. Why? The Revenant smiled. And for the first time, it spoke in a voice that wasn't a whisper. Because you are not the real enemy. Silence. Lyra's breath hitched. Karen's face paled. Ralvik's blood turned to ice. What does that mean? The Revenant slowly raised a single finger, pointing to the sky. They are coming. A sound rumbled through the clouds. A deep guttural hum. Something ancient. Something massive. Something far worse than the Shadow Fleet. Ralvik's voice was barely a whisper. Oh no, the nightmare that stalks the stars. Ralvik's pulse pounded in his ears. The Revenant, this thing that had defied reality itself, shrugged off weapons and toyed with them like insects, had just pointed to the sky and warned them. They are coming. A low, rumbling sound shook the ground. It wasn't thunder. It wasn't an explosion. It was something else. Something ancient. Something watching. Lyra grabbed Ralvik's arm, her fingers digging into his suit. What does it mean? Who's coming? The Revenant smiled again. Not cruelly. Almost, sadly. The ones we have been running from. The forgotten enemy. Kieran's fists clenched. Running. The Shadow Fleet doesn't run from anyone. The Revenant tilted its head. Then why do you think we stay in the shadows? The sky above shuddered. Something massive moved beyond the clouds. A ripple, like space itself, was peeling apart. Lyra gasped, staring up in horror. That's not a ship. She was right. Ships were built. This thing was grown. It had no engines, no weapons. It was the weapon. A living, writhing shadow against the stars. And it was watching them. The hunter wakes. Ralvik felt it, deep in his bones. A presence. Not just big, not just powerful. Hungry. His vision blurred, his breathing became shallow. He could feel something pulling at his mind. Something ancient, trying to understand him. Lyra staggered back, clutching her head. It's inside my thoughts. Kieran roared, shaking his head violently. Get out of my head, you freak. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The world snapped back into focus. The Revenant was staring at the sky. They know you exist now. Ralvik's blood ran cold. Lyra took a step forward, her voice trembling. Who? What are they? The Revenant slowly turned its gaze to her. The first ones. A heavy silence filled the battlefield. They ruled the stars before life even crawled from the oceans. They were never meant to return. Kieran's face was pale. But now they have. The Revenant nodded. Because of you. A war they cannot win. Ralvik forced himself to breathe. His people, the Deathworlders, had spent years waging war against the Shadow Fleet. They had thought they were fighting the ultimate enemy. But the Shadow Fleet was just another pawn in the game. And now, because they had pushed too hard, they had drawn the attention of something far worse. Something that didn't just conquer. Something that erased entire species like they had never existed. Lyra's voice was barely a whisper. How do we stop them? The Revenant's smile finally faded. You don't. The sky ripped open, and the nightmare stepped through.